So you've got the Scarlet One, the Wicked One of the West. Who else do you have? Hermione. That's right, we're talking witches today. My name is Steven, and welcome to My Apologies. An apology doesn't just mean saying that you're sorry. An apology can also mean giving a reason for something that you believe. For example, if I ask you why you think Star Trek is better than Star Wars, I'm asking for an apology. On this channel, we will examine various apologies for living a life of faith and virtue. And if I say something that offends you, you have my apologies. Today we're going to cover, like I mentioned in the beginning, the topic of witches. And this is for two main reasons. One, it's just an interesting topic. I was feeling like we should have a little bonus episode here at the beginning. I'm still getting the hang of this whole podcast thing, but I'm really enjoying myself. And even in the midst of that, I was kind of feeling the weight of all the philosophical conversations that we were having around the beginning of C.S. Lewis's book. It's really good content, but I wanted to shake things up a little bit, and he mentions something at the end of one of his chapters for us to kind of digest, and it has to do with witches. It's not just fun to talk about them, but Lewis is also using it in Mere Christianity to make a point for us, one that I think we can talk about today. So let's get started. Magic has always been part of the world around us. As humans, the world is a magical place, full of adventure and things that we just do not understand. There are so many phenomena that are still explainable to us, but even more so as you go further back into history. Think of lightning, for example. I'm going to be honest, I can't explain lightning to you. Like, as I was playing this podcast out, I probably could have looked up Wikipedia and come up with some kind of quick explanation to make myself sound like I know what I'm talking about. But if I'm being honest, even today, I don't really know what lightning is. It's like air passing through burned air or something. If you know, leave a comment, let me know. I'd be interested to hear your explanation. But I have some kind of concept of what lightning is in this scientific way. But if I lived 500 years ago, I would have no idea. No wonder they thought it was Thor casting lightning bolts or some other god who is striking out with vengeance. These things just seem so mysterious, so much bigger than we are as human beings. Medicine, for example, before a few hundred years ago, we didn't know that germs caused diseases. We didn't know that something so small that you can't see it is affecting our lives. So it's natural for a human who gets sick or who maybe has a loved one pass away or is living through the Black Plague to wonder, what's causing this? Is God mad at me? Or maybe is one of my neighbors someone who's using magic and cursing me? To this end, we end up with witches. A witch is a person thought to have magical powers, especially evil ones, often thought to have been given these powers by the devil himself or some kind of demonic spirit. This could have been the result of them selling their soul to the devil or making some other kind of nefarious deal in order to get their way or get some kind of magical ability. Cultures all over the world have had this concept of magical beings or humans that could do sorcery, things like that, and it could be neutral or it could be mischievous or even evil. The earliest centuries of the Christian church actually were against the hunting of witches for an interesting reason. We'll get into that. Early councils and synods for the first couple hundred years of the church, they actually had the practice of penance for those who participated in devil worship. And when you think about it, this really makes sense. If you're the early church, you exist in this world where most people around you worship pagan gods. They have pagan practices. They might kill animals or do other things that would be thought of as looking like witchcraft today. That was just the norm. So if you're a church member in the year 300, you're not as concerned about your neighbor sacrificing a goat as you would be if you live in 2023. So up through these few couple hundred years of the church, it's just seen as pagan practice. It's something to be rid of course, if you're going to be a Christian. But if you find yourself falling into that, it's a serious sin, don't get me wrong, but you just have penance, right? You're not at risk of being burned at the stake for this. Even beyond that, up into the year 1000 and beyond, well into church history, you see the Christian world responding to this idea of witches and witchcraft and considering it to be a superstition. As late as 1080, Pope Gregory VII was writing to the King of Denmark forbidding witches from being killed. And the reason wasn't because you might accidentally kill someone who's not a witch or maybe that we should be kind to witches. No, the idea for why you shouldn't kill someone as a witch is because they're saying witches don't exist. This isn't something that Christians should believe. The devil in their minds, doesn't interact with humans in this way. But things start to kind of turn around in the late 15th century into the early 16th century because of a combination of factors. Folk magic starts to become more and more popular within this Christianized Europe. The devil becomes, in this context, a really easy person to blame when something goes wrong, like if your fields all wither away and die. It might not be pestilence, it might be the devil. Or if you're otherwise really healthy, family member gets sick all of a sudden, you might be concerned that someone is casting a spell on them. This folk magic and the idea of blaming the devil and blaming people who are in cahoots with the devil becomes more and more popular. And then also the idea of heresy, meaning someone preaching against what the church teaches. That idea of heresy began to be paired with the idea of witchcraft. Those two things started to go together. Whereas before, someone could be a heretic, quote unquote, as in they were teaching something against the church, without them being in league with the devil, right? But now these two ideas start to be paired. And so with this perfect storm, witch hunts begin to spring up in Europe and then eventually into the New World. So the earliest example of a witch hunt took place in Switzerland in 1428. And we think of witches as being primarily females. If we're at Hogwarts, maybe the male equivalent would be a wizard. But at that time, in this witch hunt, it was actually primarily men who were persecuted as witches. Over the span of 8 years, 367 people died, according to some reports. And according to these accounts, we see common accusations like someone trading going to church regularly on Sunday for the ability to fly. Or more specifically, to ride on a flying chair. Now, that's a pretty dope trade. You don't go to church on Sunday and you're gifted with a chair that can magically fly. I'm not saying you should do it, but that's kind of a cool picture in my mind. Other accusations were that people were becoming werewolves and eating livestock, and even knowing the recipe to a potion of invisibility. Not even that they used the potion, but that they knew the recipe to make the potion. Super interesting. So again, that's what often people call the first mass witch hunt. Perhaps the most famous witch hunt, you've probably heard of it, it would be the Salem witch trials in Massachusetts, in the New World, in what would become America. It took place from February 1692 to May 1693, and over 200 people were accused. People were flinging accusations everywhere. In the end, after the dust kind of settled, 20 people had been killed, 6 of which were men, 14 were women, and 5 additional people sadly perished in prison. It all started when 2 children in this village of Salem, Betty Paris and Abigail Williams, started acting strangely. A local doctor checked them out, and of course, naturally, he came to the conclusion that their strange behavior was being caused by dark magic. Other people in the village started to become afflicted similarly as well, and so the source of the witchcraft needed to be rooted out. Eventually, some of these sick people started pointing fingers at other women, mostly in the village, and that caused this mass hysteria that wouldn't calm down until a year later. Accusations were flung everywhere, people were killed. What a mess, all because people believed in witches. So that's a little bit about the history of witches and witchcraft. But what about the folk history? What about the things that your average person would have believed? It's really easy for us to look back on all that history and say, man, these people were lunatics. They were killing each other, calling each other witches for nothing. Witches don't even exist. Well, to their minds, witches did exist. So let's examine some folk history, try to give ourselves a mental picture of what it might be like to live life with witches around. Starting off with the story of Hansel and Gretel. It's a sister and brother in a German fairy tale. I guess it's a fairy tale. It's a Grimm brothers tale, so fairy might not be the best descriptor for it. It's more like a dark, depressing tale. But the sister and brother belong to a family very poor. They don't have enough money to really hardly buy food. And so their mom comes up with a plan to get rid of them, basically sends them into the forest to get lost. So they get lost, they're stumbling around trying to find their way back home, and eventually they don't stumble upon their house. They stumble upon an unfamiliar house to them. But this house is not made of wood or stone. It's made of cake and sugar and frosting. Think a Candyland kind of scenario. Naturally, as kids, they're hungry, and kids love sugar anyway. Heck, I love sugar. We talked about this in a previous episode. So they run and start eating up the house, only to discover that the house belongs to a witch. And that witch, watching these kids eat her house, she wants to eat them. So the witch captures the kids and throws them into the house, and she's starting up the oven. She's preparing to cook the kids. She tells Gretel, the girl, "Why don't you go in and inspect the oven, see how hot it is?" Gretel sees through that charade and she's like, "I don't know how to go in the oven." So the witch responds, basically, "Dummy, you just stick your head in." And when the witch does it, Gretel kicks her in the oven and closes the door behind her, and the witch gets what she deserves. She gets cooked instead of the kids. So it's a happy ending, but super morbid. What do we learn from this about witches? Well, if you believe this story at the time, if you're telling your kids this, they're not telling their kids about Santa Claus. They're telling their kids about evil witches that are going to eat them. So you learn a couple things. Witches, one, have delicious houses. Not such a bad trait. But, number two, they eat children. They're cannibals. Imagine yourself believing something like this, or at least having the idea that it could exist. Imagine your neighbor next door or someone down the street. You might already think they're a little bit shady from the way that they glance at you when you're walking your dog, but you probably don't think that they're considering eating your child. But if you actually imagine a world in which you think witches exist, that could be a genuine concern. The next story we have is Snow White, another grim tale. In this story, we're not going to cover the whole thing, but to get some bullet points, we have the Wicked Witch. She has a magic mirror that she can use to spy on people, and the mirror talks to her. Fun fact about this, you may know the quote, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all?" Well, this is one of those situations where we all remember it incorrectly, and the phrase in the movie is actually magic mirror on the wall. It just doesn't have the same ring to it, does it? But that's what it is. Anyway, Snow White, this witch, has a magical mirror with which she can use to spy on people. She also has the ability to poison people with fruit. She gives Snow White a poison apple that puts her into a deep sleep, which basically resembles death. Now imagine this, if you were concerned about the lady who doesn't like you at work, you think she might be a witch who is spying on you with a magic mirror and planning on giving you poisoned fruit in the fruit bowl at lunch. Or maybe that guy who keeps giving you weird glances across the coffee shop, looking over his shoulder. Is he planning something? Maybe he's a witch. Now we don't believe that, again. But if you lived in a world where that was a possibility, you could see how this would become a problem. Third, we're going to move out of the area of grim tales and move into C.S. Lewis himself. We are, after all, in a Mere Christianity series. We're going to look at the lion, the witch, and the wardrobe. It's there in the name. This is an easy one. The main antagonist of these books is the White Witch. She has power over the weather. She's described as being able to make it always winter and never Christmas, which is horrifying if you're a small child. Or me. And then when Lucy, one of the main characters, a small girl, when her friend Mr. Tumnus is captured and taken to the witch's castle, she asks what will become of him. She finds out from Mr. Beaver. He says, "Well, you can't actually say for sure, but there's not many taken in there," meaning her castle, "that ever come out again. Statues, all full of statues, they say it is. In the courtyard and up the stairs and in the hall, people she's turned." He paused and shuddered. "Turned into stone." So in this Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe kids book, we've got a terrifying castle that no one comes out of alive. Like imagine a North Korea kind of situation. No one goes out, no one comes in, no one really likes to work for the witch, no one really wants to be there. And anyone who gets taken in there as a prisoner gets turned into stone. A terrible fate for anyone to have to endure. So we've got some stories, we've got some pictures of what witches could possibly do. Hopefully you've been able to relate at least a little bit and understand what it might kind of be like if you actually thought witches existed. But we live in a rational, scientific age. We know they don't exist, right? And to this, C.S. Lewis has a really interesting quote at the end of chapter 2 of his first book in Mere Christianity. He's kind of addressing the fact that some people consider it ridiculous to think that there's a common morality when you look back into history and see things as insane as the Salem witch trials or these mass murders of people being just accused of being witches. He says, for example, one man said to me, 300 years ago, people in England were putting witches to death. Was that what you call the rule of human nature or right conduct? And then he responds to that person. But surely the reason we do not execute witches is that we do not believe that there are such things. If we did, if we really thought that there were people going about who had sold themselves to the devil and received supernatural powers from him in return, and were using these powers to kill their neighbors or drive them mad or bring bad weather, well, Surely we would all agree that if anyone deserved the death penalty, these filthy quislings did. There is no difference of moral principle here. The difference is simply a matter of fact. It may be a great advance in knowledge not to believe in witches, sure. But there is no moral advance in not executing them when you do not think they are there. You would not call a man humane for ceasing to set mouse traps if he did so because he believed there were no mice in the house. Such a good line that he uses to end the chapter. You would not call a man humane for ceasing to set mouse traps if he did so because he believed there were no mice in the house. So what's the point he's trying to make here? Lewis is saying that there is no virtue in you, a modern man or woman, being against killing witches. It's about as useful as you picketing for ghosts to have human rights or for mermaids to be given the right to open bank accounts and have their own credit cards. There's no virtue in not killing witches because you don't think there are any witches to be killed in the first place. And he further makes the point, if you really did believe in witches, you probably ought to want to get rid of them. They wouldn't be good people to have around. And off of this, how often do we think we're righteous people or kind people or generally good people when we really just have no occasion for sin, no occasion to be rude or mean to other people? We live in such a rational, safe environment in general. I know some people have it harder than others, but compared to where we would have been 100 years ago, 200 years ago, or even more, we even have a phrase now. First world problems is what we call them. And that's most of the things that we have to deal with from a day-to-day basis. The kinds of things that stress us out. They're first world problems, not the kinds of things that people would have been dealing with back whenever witch hunts were a thing. Now, the main point is not to defend the morality of witch hunts. That's not what we're trying to do here. And we're also not trying to prove whether or not witches exist. Spoiler alert, sorry, Harry Potter fans, myself included, they don't exist. But the main point is, despite the fact that we can say something that happened in the past was immoral or that people committed an immoral act, we should not look back at the past at people who had an entirely different worldview and probably lacked a lot of the understanding that we have the benefit of having now, and think that we're morally superior to them. Like Lewis says, it may be a great advancement for us, to our great advantage, to have the knowledge that witches don't exist. But he says, there is no moral advance in not executing them when you do not think they are there. So that's our episode today. A quick little bonus episode on witches. Hopefully you had fun covering the history of witches, talking about a couple of short witch stories, and then getting a little bit of C.S. Lewis wisdom there at the end. If you enjoyed this episode, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the different format, hear if you like this shorter version or not. You can reach out to me on Twitter at myapologies, or you can join my locals page and let me know what you think. If you enjoyed this episode, please click the like button and subscribe. I post every week, so if you want to be notified when I post a new video, ring the little bell to turn on notifications. Until next time, my name is Stephen Tran, and this has been My Apologies.